My father was a school custodian for 31 years at Millbrook Elementary in Dayton, Ohio. He mopped the same hallways, fixed the same leaky faucets, replaced the same fluorescent bulbs in the same classrooms until the district finally upgraded to LED. He knew every teacher by first name and every kid by their locker number. He retired on a Friday in June 7 years ago with a sheet cake from the grocery store and a card signed by the front office staff. He died on a Tuesday in February. Heart attack, 64 years old. He was shoveling the front walk because the neighbor's dog had gotten into the yard again and he didn't want anyone to slip. That was my father. The funeral was small. My mother had passed when I was 19, so it was mostly my aunt from Columbus, a few of his co-workers from the school, and my older brother, who drove in from Pittsburgh and kept checking his phone. We buried him in Woodland Cemetery, the one on Brown Street, in the section where the older headstones lean a little from the frost heave. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your collar no matter how you hold your coat. I stood at the grave after everyone had moved toward the cars. I wasn't ready to leave. I don't know how to explain that. I just wasn't ready. He was my dad, and now he was gone, and the ground was frozen. And I kept thinking about the fact that he had retired with a grocery store cake and nobody had even taken a photo. That's when she walked up. I almost didn't notice her at first. She was older, maybe 70, wearing a dark wool coat and low-heeled boots that were practical, not decorative. She moved carefully on the frozen grass. She had the bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people stood up when she entered. She stopped about 3 feet from me and looked at the headstone for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "You must be Willa." I turned to look at her. I didn't recognize her face. "Yes," I said. "I served with your father on the District Facilities Advisory Board for 11 years, she said. "He never mentioned it to you, did he?" It wasn't a question. "No," I said, "he didn't." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a small envelope. Not a greeting card. Just a plain white envelope, sealed, with my name written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize. "Your father asked me to give you this when the time came," she said. "He was very specific about when." She paused. "When you're ready, call the number inside. Ask for the office of the Glenfield Community Endowment. Tell them Kenneth Ashton's daughter is calling. They'll know what to do." I looked down at the envelope. When I looked up, she was already walking back toward the road. I didn't call after her. I don't know why. I just stood there holding the envelope while the wind moved through the bare trees and the last of the cars pulled out of the cemetery, and my brother texted me from the parking lot asking if I was coming. I put the envelope in my coat pocket and went to the car. That night I sat at my father's kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten every breakfast for the last 20 years, the one with the burn mark near the left corner from when he'd set a hot pan down without thinking, and I opened the envelope. Inside was a business card, simple, white. It said, "Glenfield Community Endowment, Cincinnati, Ohio," a phone number, an address on Reading Road, and a single index card in my father's handwriting. "Willa, I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. Call them. Let them explain it better than I could have. I love you. Don't let your brother make decisions before you understand everything." Dad-I read it 3 times. Then I put it down on the table and stared at the burn mark on the corner until it was almost midnight. My brother called at 8 the next morning. He wanted to talk about the house. Dad owned it outright. He'd paid it off 4 years ago, and my brother felt like we should list it in the spring before the market softened. He had a cousin who was a realtor. He'd already looked up comps in the neighborhood. I told him I wasn't ready to talk about that yet. He said he understood, but in the tone that meant he didn't. I waited until he hung up, and then I called the number on the card. A woman answered on the second ring, professional, calm. "Glenfield Community Endowment, how can I help you?" "My name is Willa Ashton," I said. "Kenneth Ashton's daughter. I was told to call." A brief pause. Not the kind that means they're confused, the kind that means something has shifted. "Miss Ashton," she said, "we've been expecting your call. Can you come to our offices in Cincinnati?" There's a meeting I'd like to arrange for you. I asked what the meeting was about. She said, Your father would prefer you hear it in person. I know that sounds unusual. I promise it will make sense when you get here. I drove to Cincinnati on a Thursday, 2 hours south on 75. I'd made the drive dozens of times growing up. My mother's family was from there, but I hadn't been back in years. The office was in a building on Reading Road that looked like it might have been a converted house in a previous life. Brick, a small parking lot, a brass plate next to the door that said Glenfield Community Endowment, S 2003. The woman who had answered the phone met me in the lobby. Her name was Miss Thorne. She was around 50, efficient without being cold, and she brought me back to a conference room where a man in his late 60s was already seated. He stood when I came in. Miss Ashton, he said. I'm the endowment's legal counsel. I've handled your father's account for 14 years. Please sit down. I sat. He opened a folder in front of him and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father, Kenneth Ashton, established a donor-advised fund through the Glenfield Community Endowment in March of 2003. For 22 years, he contributed to this fund consistently. He named you the successor advisor upon his death. I heard the words. I'm not sure I understood them immediately. A donor-advised fund, I said. Yes. It allows individuals to make charitable contributions, receive immediate tax benefits, and then recommend grants to specific nonprofits over time. Your father contributed a portion of his income every year for over 2 decades. He also transferred the title to a small rental property he owned in Huber Heights in 2009. The rental income was directed into the fund. The fund was invested conservatively but steadily. I looked at him. How much are we talking about? I asked. He looked at the folder. The current balance is just under $412,000. I didn't say anything. The hum of the HVAC system was very loud in that moment. My father, I said slowly, was a school custodian. Yes, he said. He was. He drove a 2009 Civic until it had 200,000 miles on it. I know. He mentioned that once, actually. Said it was one of the best vehicles he'd ever owned. I pressed my hands flat on the table. What was the fund for? I asked. What did he do with it? The attorney glanced at Miss Thorne, then back at me. Your father directed grants every year to 3 organizations, he said. A scholarship fund at Jefferson High School in Dayton. He contributed to 15 students' college expenses over the course of 20 years. A program at Dayton Children's that provides sensory equipment for children with developmental disabilities. And a small emergency relief fund that he established through a local church, which provides one-time assistance to families facing utility shutoffs or medical debt. He slid a document across the table. It was a summary, 22 years of giving, broken into columns by year and by recipient organization. Clean numbers, small and steady and relentless. My father had given away over $230,000 over his lifetime, quietly, without telling a single person I knew of. I thought about the grocery store cake. I thought about the card signed by the front office staff. I thought about him shoveling the walk in the February cold because he didn't want anyone to slip. I cried in that conference room. I didn't try not to. Miss Thorne slid a box of tissues across the table without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. When I got myself back together, I asked what successor advisor meant. The attorney explained it clearly. As the named successor, I would take over responsibility for recommending future grants from the fund. The money was not mine to keep. It could not be inherited in the traditional sense. It existed to give. My father had structured it that way deliberately. He'd had the document reviewed and updated in 2019, just 5 years ago. He thought about this carefully, the attorney said. He wanted the fund to continue. He believed you would understand why. I drove home in a kind of silence I don't have a name for. My brother called that evening. He had apparently talked to a friend of his who'd done some estate research and had questions about whether there were additional assets beyond the house. I told him I'd been to Cincinnati. He asked what was in Cincinnati. I said there was something Dad had set up a long time ago, and I needed a little more time to understand it before I could explain it fully. He pushed. That's my brother's way. He asked if it was financial. He asked if it affected the estate. He asked if there was something I wasn't telling him. I said, it doesn't change what you'd inherit from the estate. The house, the car, what's in his accounts. That's all straightforward. So what was in Cincinnati? I thought for a moment about what my father had written on that index card. Don't let your brother make decisions before you understand everything. Dad left me a responsibility, I said, not an asset, a responsibility. He didn't know what to do with that, so he said he'd call me next week when things had settled, and he hung up. 2 weeks later, I drove back to Cincinnati. I met with Miss Thorne and the attorney again, this time to begin the process of formally accepting the successor advisor role. There was paperwork, signatures, an explanation of the process for recommending grants, which was more straightforward than I'd expected. Twice a year, I could submit grant recommendations to a list of eligible nonprofits. The fund's investments would continue to grow in between. At the end of the meeting, the attorney handed me a file folder. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting. 5 pages, front and back, yellow legal pad, the same blue pen he'd used his entire life. He explained everything. He wrote about my mother, who had died of cancer when I was 19, and about how the hospital bills had come after she was gone, and how he had spent 3 years paying them down and had vowed, quietly, that he would spend whatever he had left helping other families not face the same particular combination of grief and debt at the same time. He wrote about a teacher at Millbrook, a woman named something. He didn't give her full name, just called her the reading teacher in room 14, who had told him once that she'd had a student who couldn't afford the application fee to apply to college and had watched the kids simply not apply. My father had carried that story for a long time. He wrote about the rental property. He'd bought it in 2005 for $72,000, a small house in Huber Heights that needed work, and he had done most of the repairs himself over a long weekend in August. He'd rented it out for years to a young family. When the family bought their own home, he transferred the property title to the endowment rather than find new tenants. He wrote about me. He said he'd watched me work hard and struggle and keep going, the way I always had, and that he trusted me more than he could say to understand what the money was for. He said he wasn't leaving me wealth. He said he was leaving me something better. He usually used that word, better, but that he knew that was a lot to put on someone, and he was sorry for not giving me more warning. He signed it the way he signed birthday cards. Love, Dad. I sat in the parking lot of the Glenfield Community Endowment for a long time after that. Just sat. The letter in my lap. The folder on the passenger seat. I thought about the scholarship applications I'd need to learn to evaluate. I thought about calling Dayton Children's to understand the sensory program better. I thought about the Church Relief Fund and whether it could serve more families with a little more structure. I thought about the reading teacher in room 14 and the kid who didn't apply to college. I thought about my father mopping the same hallways for 31 years and nobody ever knowing. In the spring, I met with the Jefferson High Scholarship Committee for the first time. I introduced myself as Kenneth Ashton's daughter. One of the committee members, a retired guidance counselor, quiet woman, sensible shoes, looked up when I said his name. Kenny, she said. You're Kenny's daughter. Yes, I said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. He called every year, she said, always in October. He'd ask how the fund was doing, if the kids were doing all right. He never wanted recognition. He told me once that the whole point was that the kids didn't know where it came from. He wanted them to think the community had rallied for them. She paused. He said if a kid knew it was one janitor giving them money, they might feel like they owed something. He wanted them to feel like they were just held up by something larger than one person. I wrote that down later, in a notebook I bought specifically for this. My brother and I had a longer conversation in April, about 2 months after the funeral. I told him the full story then. The endowment, the fund, the structure, what it meant. I was honest. He couldn't inherit it. It wasn't that kind of asset. He was quiet for longer than I expected. Then he said, "Dad never said a word." "No," I said, "he didn't." Another silence. Did he ever have fun? Did he ever just spend money on something for himself? I thought about the Civic with 200,000 miles. I thought about the burn mark on the kitchen table. I thought about the fact that his television was from 2011 and he'd taped a piece of cardboard over the one speaker that buzzed. "I think," I said, "that this was the thing he spent himself on." My brother didn't say anything for a while. Then he said he guessed he understood. Not completely, maybe, but enough. I still live in Dayton. I kept my regular job. I do billing and coding for a physical therapy practice. Nothing glamorous. But twice a year I drive to Cincinnati, and I sit in that conference room and I recommend grants. I read applications from guidance counselors writing on behalf of seniors who can't cover the gap between financial aid and tuition. I read reports from Dayton Children's about how many kids used the sensory room last quarter. I read the short updates from the church fund about the families who received emergency assistance. My father is in those updates, not by name, but he's there. I went back to Woodland Cemetery on the first anniversary of his death. February again. Still cold, still that particular gray of Ohio in winter. I brought a small bunch of flowers, the kind that hold up in the cold, and I stood in the same place I'd stood when the woman in the dark wool coat had walked up and handed me the envelope. I thought about what she had said. He was very specific about when. He had known, apparently, for some time that his heart wasn't right. He hadn't told me. That was also very like him, not to want to alarm me, not to make me worry through months of watching him decline. He had handled things in advance instead, quietly, without fuss. I thought about the index card. "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." I forgave him easily for that. Some people talk about the things that matter to them. My father built them instead and left a key on an index card in a plain white envelope for whoever came after. I am whatever comes after. The wind moved through the bare trees at the edge of the cemetery, the same as it had the year before. I stood there until the cold got too serious to ignore. And then I walked back to the car, and I drove home through the gray Ohio afternoon, and I thought about the fall grant cycle, and whether the scholarship fund could take on one more student this year. And I thought it probably could, and I thought my father would think so too.